The story for today is a bit of a wild ride. It's about the tumultuous years of the rise and fall of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Now, the story of the kings is actually quite simple. If they walked with God, things went well. Well for that king and for the people. Kings like Jehoshaphat were really good kings. But if they didn't follow God, if they didn't walk with God, things would go bad. Things would go poorly for the people. And it wasn't until there would be some kind of restoration that involved repentance would things turn around again and be good for them. Now, it's not so much that God was punishing the people during the bad times, so much as God would withhold divine protection. God would let the consequences of their actions stand. And really what their actions were doing were the things that were hurting them the most. Because you see, the people had become settled at this point. They were less isolated. They were traveling. They were doing commerce and trade. And they brought back lots of goods. They brought back lots of brides. And it exposed them to new ideas and especially new gods. And so some of those kings like Manasseh, would consult mediums and would even do human sacrifice to whatever gods would promise them the prosperity that they sought. Kings like Ahaz, who was actually very weak and indecisive, and basically he could be easily pressured by those nations around them, and he made some really bad alliances with nations that were maybe powerful, but they were cruel and immoral. So many of the kings turned to idols, to these empty gods that would promise them false things. And they turned their back on God. And as people would stop doing the rituals that had been developed, as they stopped reading and remembering their story, they began to lose not just their history, but their identity. They turned their back not just on God, but on God's covenant, on all those things that God had promised to them. During this time was also a split in the Hebrew people. It actually split right after Solomon, with his son coming to the throne. The people in the north, the 10 tribes that were in the north, didn't recognize him because of his just sheer arrogance. And so they split off and they created their own nation. It was called Israel, and their capital was in Samaria. The southern part was derived from the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, and it became known as Judah. And their capital remained in Jerusalem. But this was over more than just religion and politics and things like that. It was about where was the center of power. Where was the center of religion? Did we have to go to Jerusalem to worship God, or could we worship God where we are? It was actually kind of a rural and urban kind of thing, too. The northern kingdoms were much more rural and just wanted to be near God where they were, rather than having to travel to a city far away. Now, in the ups and downs of all the nations, the northern kingdom, Israel, was the first one to fall. They were conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BC. Now, because of that, the south kingdom was they are the ones who got to write the history, and they blamed their early fall on their apostasy for not coming and worshiping in Jerusalem. This leads to some of the tensions you even see in Jesus' time with the Samaritans who are God-fearers, but they're not really good Jews. Now, the southern kingdom of Judah was able to stave off their demise for quite a bit longer, mostly because they had a series of really good kings, beginning with Hezekiah, who it says would wait on the Lord. But for Hezekiah, waiting was not just a passive thing like seeing that maybe God will come and magically rescue them. No, for Hezekiah, it was an active thing. It was working with God to dig cisterns and fortify the walls to help them withstand a siege. After him, later on, there was Josiah, who reinstitutes the law of Moses. They begin celebrating the Passover again, this really important ritual, this holiday that reminded the people who they were and what God had done for them. They remembered again God's promises, and it gave them strength, and it gave them purpose, and it helped them survive. Unfortunately, it didn't last long. After a number of really good kings, they had a number of really bad kings. And the southern kingdom was eventually conquered by the Babylonians. And this begins the time of what we call the exile, where the people are taken out of their land, they're stripped of their identity, and they're taken someplace else. Now, a lot of time passes, but at the end of the book of Second Chronicles, the Persians come in and conquer the Babylonians. And Cyrus, the leader of the Persians, sends all the people of Judah back home. And some people call him the Messiah. That doesn't mean that they got to rule themselves. The Persians were still in charge. And so, in fact, God had other plans. God wasn't going to send a Messiah who would be a military warrior. God doesn't use fighting and killing to accomplish the covenant and promise. And so instead, God sends a bunch of priests and prophets. Stories that I'm going to tell you over the next couple of weeks, next couple of days, that are going to overlap with one another. But they remind us that God's hope is elsewhere.